Once it became clear that enemy bombers were not about to erase London and Paris overnight, the rhythm of daily life slowly returned. Fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. Nights were swallowed by blackout regulations, turning streets into pitch-black corridors where the greatest danger was no longer bombs, but speeding cars. In those early months of war, thousands of pedestrians were killed simply because darkness ruled the city. The blackout also produced strange social side effects. Young couples used the shadows for stolen intimacy in shop doorways, a habit that quickly became the subject of jokes on the music hall stage. Cinemas reopened. Theaters raised their curtains again. London's pubs overflowed with noise and smoke. In Paris, cafes remained full, and familiar songs reassured people that the city's soul still lived. The destruction of Poland already felt distant, pushed aside by routine. While the war on land and in the air drifted into stagnation, the struggle at sea grew sharp and unforgiving. Britain's naval war began with a bitter mistake, when one British submarine sank another in confusion. Small victories followed, but confidence collapsed when German submarines struck back hard. The sinking of major British warships sent a shock through the nation. For the first time, the Royal Navy no longer felt untouchable. German warships roaming the Atlantic intensified pressure, but one reckless seizure of an American freighter proved politically disastrous. In the United States, public opinion began to turn. After Poland, this act made neutrality feel less moral and less practical. The Allies' need for weapons suddenly gained sympathy across the ocean. In Berlin, Hitler publicly offered peace on his own terms. He assumed Britain and France would accept his conquests. Behind closed doors, however, he was already planning another war. His generals urged caution, warning of logistics, weather, and exhausted troops. Hitler interpreted hesitation as weakness. Meetings turned hostile. Commanders left, humiliated, knowing that obedience mattered more than realism. Within the German high command, fear deepened. Some officers quietly dreamed of removing Hitler, but the shadow of the secret police hung over every conversation. Documents were destroyed. Silence became survival. To the east, Stalin wasted no time. Territories promised by secret agreements were seized, and pressure mounted on smaller neighbors. Finland was summoned to Moscow and presented with demands for land, ports, and strategic positions. The price was too high. Negotiations stalled, and Stalin concluded that Finland was isolated and would not resist. A fabricated border incident provided the excuse. Diplomatic ties were cut. Bombers struck Finnish cities. Soviet leaders expected a quick victory, confident that overwhelming numbers would crush resistance within days. They were wrong. Finland answered with resolve. An aging marshal returned to command a small, under-equipped army. Trenches, forests, frozen lakes, and narrow roads became weapons. Soviet troops poorly prepared for winter warfare advanced through deep snow in dark uniforms that made them easy targets. Minefields tore columns apart. White-clad Finnish soldiers appeared and vanished like ghosts. In the frozen north and center of the country, Soviet forces were forced onto forest roads, where fast-moving ski troops ambushed them relentlessly. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Weapons froze. Morale collapsed. What was meant to be a simple campaign turned into a brutal lesson. Numbers alone could not conquer terrain, climate, and determination. As the snow absorbed the sound of battle, the world watched a small nation defy a giant and rewrite expectations of modern war. Winter turned Finland into a weapon. Rather than confronting the Red Army head-on, Finnish commanders chose a method born from forests and frost. Long Soviet columns, forced to move along narrow roads, were cut apart piece by piece. Supply lines vanished. Units became isolated, hungry, and helpless. The Finns called this method log-cutting, not crushing the tree in one blow, but slicing it until it collapsed. Out of the frozen fog came ski troops, moving without sound. They struck tanks with bottles of burning fuel, hurled grenades into packed formations, and vanished before the Soviets could respond. It was not a conventional battlefield, it was a hunt. The Red Army, trained for rigid, textbook warfare, had no answer for enemies who refused to stand still. To deny shelter, Finnish forces burned farms and barns ahead of advancing Soviet troops. Roads were mined. Traps waited beneath the snow. The wounded had little chance of survival. In the extreme cold, minutes were enough to turn pain into death. Soviet soldiers began whispering a new name for their invisible attackers. White death figures dressed in snow. Camouflage who appeared, killed, and disappeared among the trees. Entire Soviet divisions were destroyed this way. One unit was surrounded and wiped out in the forests. Another marched in to rescue them and met the same fate, shattered into fragments along frozen roads. When foreign journalists later reached the area, they found scenes that looked unreal, bodies frozen exactly where they had fallen, weapons still clutched in stiff hands, supply wagons abandoned mid-movement, as if time itself had stopped. The shockwaves spread far beyond Finland. International outrage followed, and the Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations, ending its role there in disgrace. In Western Europe, anger over the invasion burned as fiercely as reactions to the fall of Poland. Sympathy for Finland ran deep, and calls grew louder for military assistance. This placed Germany in an awkward position. While benefiting from Soviet supplies, Berlin feared alienating Scandinavian countries whose trade, especially iron ore, was vital for its war industries. The idea of British and French troops appearing in Northern Europe unsettled Nazi planners. Still, Hitler remained confident, convinced that fate itself was protecting him. That belief was reinforced when he narrowly escaped death. A bomb planted to kill him exploded shortly after he left a crowded hall in Munich. Others died in his place. To Hitler, survival felt like proof of destiny. To the British public, the reaction was cold or resigned, almost dismissive, as if the opportunity had simply been missed. The aftermath deepened the Shadow War. A lone attacker was arrested, but Nazi propaganda blamed British intelligence. Soon after, German security forces trapped and kidnapped British agents during a fake meeting across the Dutch border. It was an early warning of how ruthless and deceptive the secret war would become. At sea, however, Britain finally found something to celebrate. An outmatched merchant cruiser chose to fight German warships rather than surrender, firing until she burned and sank with her flag still flying. The story became a symbol of defiance. Days later, a dramatic naval battle unfolded off South America. British cruisers cornered a German raider that had already claimed multiple victims. Though damaged, the German ship escaped into a neutral harbor. Through bluff and deception, the British convinced its captain that overwhelming forces awaited him. Faced with impossible odds, he chose to destroy his own ship rather than let it be captured. Soon after, he took his own life. For Britain, it was a rare morale boost during a bleak winter. For Hitler, it was a reminder that symbols mattered as much as steel. Even ship names became political weapons. As the war widened, perception, confidence, and belief would prove just as decisive as guns and armies. The winter of 1939 arrived, wrapped in contradictions. In Germany, Christmas trees glittered in shop windows, while radios insisted the war was already being won. The Battle of the River Plate had been announced as a victory, yet the sudden news that the Grafspee had been scuttled unsettled many. Victory, people whispered, was not supposed to look like that. The Nazi leadership moved quickly to protect the mood. Rations were briefly eased. Newsreels showed smiling children and candlelit homes. And attention was pushed toward Poland's defeat. Many Germans convinced themselves the war would end soon. After all, both Berlin and Moscow were calling on Britain and France to accept the destruction of Poland as a new reality. Behind the warm images, fear crept into ordinary homes. Families received official letters explaining that a disabled child or an elderly relative had died of pneumonia. In a distant institution, too many such letters arrived. Quiet suspicion spread that these deaths were not natural. Unseen by the public, the regime had begun its first organized campaign of killing, targeting those it labeled as useless or unworthy of life. War had provided the cover Hitler had been waiting for. Hitler himself abandoned private comforts. Instead of celebrating Christmas, he staged surprise visits to military units, presenting himself as a tireless leader at the front. On New Year's Eve, he spoke of a new order in Europe, promising peace only after total victory. Across the border, Stalin answered him with polite words about friendship, even as their alliance was already soaked in Polish blood. Yet Stalin had problems of his own. In the frozen forests of Finland, the Red Army was failing badly. Poor leadership and rigid tactics had turned a quick campaign into a humiliation. For set to act, Stalin replaced commanders, introduced new weapons, and relied on overwhelming artillery. By February 1940, Finnish defenses finally cracked. Finland survived Buta at a painful cost. While armies clashed in the north, Poland continued to suffer in silence. Thousands of Polish officers, considered dangerous to the future, were taken into forests and executed. Their families were deported east. The intention was clear. Poland was not just to be defeated, but erased as an independent nation. In Western Europe, war felt strangely unreal. French soldiers sat idle behind the Maginot Line, convinced that defense alone would protect them. Training was neglected, morale sank, and boredom replaced urgency. Some officers warned that modern war demanded speed, radios, and armor, but their voices were drowned out by tradition and complacency. Paris remained lively. Cafes were full. Songs spoke of waiting, and many believed time was on their side. Few understood that the war ahead would not be limited or negotiated. It was not about borders or treaties. It was about reshaping Europe through fear, violence, and ideology. By the end of that winter, the illusion still held. But beneath the snow and silence, the foundations of catastrophe were already set. When the storm finally broke, it would leave no room for waiting.